Section 1. Qualia and Meaning. What's the relationship between qualia and intentionality? Intentionality is the philosophical term for the power of minds to be about, to represent, or to stand for things, properties, and states of affairs. The word intentionality is derived from Latin and means being directed towards some goal or thing. Intentionality is closely related to the concept of meaning, in the sense that being in an intentional mental state, by definition, means something. David Rose points out that some philosophers identify consciousness in terms of qualia, or how it feels. Others claim that consciousness is based on intentionality. In other words, consciousness is always about something, i.e. meaningful. As Rose continues, however, this proposed dichotomy raises two very basic questions. Firstly, perhaps consciousness is characterized by both qualia and intentionality. And second, maybe it's a false dichotomy, i.e. it may be that qualia, just like intentional states, always mean something. And indeed, Rose makes it clear that some philosophers have argued exactly this, quote, that qualia cannot exist without intentionality, in that all experiences have some kind of meaning, end quote. Jeffrey Gray, an experimental psychologist, argues almost the same thing. He claims that qualia, as the contents of conscious experience, are purely and entirely perceptual. But, he says, quote, this does not imply that they consist in what the philosophers call sense data, as yet uninterpreted sensory fragments awaiting integration into a meaningful or intentional whole. On the contrary, the contents of consciousness are almost always intentional, that is, interpreted as having meaning, end quote. Rose also cites Merleau-Ponty's 1945 argument that even when looking at a patch of white, there is still meaning linked with it. For example, it's a figure with shape, intensity, and function. So Merleau-Ponty is saying that qualia cannot be experienced in an elemental, abstract, isolated fashion. Rose goes on to suggest that the same applies vice versa, i.e. that intentional states always have a qualic feel attached to them, that there's something it is like to hate someone, to believe in God, or to want to understand Kant. Thus, he claims that meaning and experience always occur together. Furthermore, he claims that there is some experimental evidence to support this view. Quote, the recurrent and tightly coupled activity patterns seen in the brain during object recognition, recall, and imagery are consistent with this integrated picture, end quote. Rose then asks, quote, can we make a case for there being identity between the neural substrates of qualia and intentionality, end quote. However, Rose also has a third alternative. Rather than identity or dichotomy between qualia and intentionality, their true relationship may be a continuum. Quote, According to the serial processing view, the purest qualia would be generated in the primary regions of sensory cortex, and then progressively less vivid percepts would arise as neural activity moves away from the primary regions. For instance, thinking about your grandmother's personality, let alone justice or what Kant really meant, evokes relatively weak mental images. Stronger images can be evoked by these thoughts if we make an effort to engage imagery." End quote. In this serial processing model, incoming waves of neural activity from the sensory areas is progressively assessed for significance or meaningfulness as it moves through the nervous system. The incoming signals are assessed as to whether the stimulus is good or bad, familiar or unfamiliar, dangerous, edible, a potential mate, etc. Rose comments that, in this serial view, intentionality is increasingly built up as signals progress toward the higher centers of the brain, and they are subject to ever deeper levels of processing. Consequently, in the serial processing model, qualia and intentionality are inversely related. In other words, as meaning increases, qualia decline. This is similar to the behaviorist view that meaning arises from the associations evoked by a stimulus. As a stimulus is analyzed progressively through several stages, so the brain derives more and more meaning from the stimulus as the number of associative connections activated in the semantic network of long-term memory increases. And so there is no single point or stage at which meaningfulness starts. It's a matter of degree.